The day that's supposed to celebrate your life is the same day that reveals who truly values it. One man sat alone at a table set for 20, his phone silent, his door empty. But just before midnight, a single knock changed everything he thought he knew about himself. If you've ever felt invisible to the people closest to you, stay until the end, because this story will hit different. Hit that like button right now and subscribe, because what happens next, no one saw coming, not even him. Let me tell you something about Elliot Crane that you won't find in any introduction. He was the kind of man who kept a handwritten journal, not for himself, not for his own thoughts or dreams or fears, but for other people. Every important date in every important person's life, written down in careful, deliberate ink. Birthdays, anniversaries, the date his colleague Sandra's mother went into surgery, the date his neighbor Philip's wife passed away 4 years ago, so he could check on him every year when that week rolled around without Philip ever having to ask. He was 38 years old, a structural engineer who spent his days making sure buildings didn't fall down. And quietly, without anyone noticing, he spent his personal life doing the exact same thing for the people around him. Holding things up, keeping things standing, showing up before anyone thought to call. He lived alone in a modest apartment on the 5th floor of a building that smelled like old wood and fresh coffee in the mornings. The walls were lined with framed photographs, but if you looked closely, really closely, you'd notice something quietly heartbreaking about every single one of them. They were all photographs of other people's moments. Derek's promotion party, his sister Cora's wedding, a colleague's retirement lunch. Elliot was always the one behind the camera, always the one making sure the moment was captured for someone else to keep forever. There was not a single photograph of Elliot alone, not one moment preserved just for him. His closest friend was Derek, 15 years of friendship. Derek was loud where Elliot was quiet, magnetic where Elliot was steady. Then there was Cora, his younger sister, with a calendar so packed she once forgot to eat. She loved Elliot, genuinely, but she loved him the way people love a piece of furniture that's always exactly where you left it, reliably present, never demanding anything, easy to overlook because it never complained about being overlooked. And his mother, she was the only one who ever made Elliot feel like the main character of his own life. Every March 14th, she would call at exactly 7 a.m., sing horribly off-key, and say the same thing every single year without fail. "You are the best thing I ever made, Elliot. Don't let the world convince you otherwise." She passed away 3 years ago, and since then, March 14th had become just another date on everyone else's calendar. Unremarkable, unmarked, forgotten. Just like him. Elsa's calendar, unremarkable, unmarked, forgotten, just like him. He told himself he wasn't going to make a big deal of it this year. That's what Elliot said to himself on the morning of March 14th, standing in front of his bathroom mirror in his new shirt. A simple navy blue button-down he'd bought 3 days earlier without admitting to himself exactly why he bought it. He looked at his reflection for a moment longer than usual, straightened his collar, took a slow breath, and quietly, in the way only a person who has learned to manage their own expectations can, he told himself, "Just see how the day goes." He arrived at the office 12 minutes early, the way he always did. He made coffee for the whole floor, the way he always did. He sat at his desk and opened his emails and waited. Not obviously, not desperately, just that small, human kind of waiting that sits in the corner of your chest and watches the door. Nothing happened. The morning passed like any other morning. Keyboards clicking, phones ringing, someone microwaving something in the break room that made the whole office smell like burnt cheese. His 5 colleagues, the same 5 people he bought lunch for every single Friday without missing once in 2 years, walked past his desk throughout the morning. Sandra, Pete, Ren, all of them talking, laughing, moving through their day like it was just another Thursday. Because to them it was. Around midday, his colleague Ren leaned against his desk and said brightly, "Oh wow, is it really the 14th already? This month flew by." Then she picked up a folder and walked away. Elliot turned back to his screen and said nothing. He just nodded. Because what do you say to that? What words exist for the particular pain of being standing right next to someone who doesn't realize they're hurting you? He texted Derek at 2 p.m. Casual, easy. "Hey, anything going on tonight?" Then he put his phone face down on his desk and tried to concentrate on the structural load calculations in front of him, numbers that needed balancing, weight that needed distributing, problems with clean, findable solutions. Derek replied at 5 o'clock, 40 minutes after Elliot had already packed his bag and walked to his car alone. "Oh man, completely slipped my mind. Something came up with the guys tonight. Rain check though, seriously." Seriously. Elliot sat in the parking garage for 23 minutes. He didn't play music, he didn't scroll his phone. He just sat in the particular silence of a man who has finally, undeniably, run out of ways to explain away the people he loves. Cora's message arrived at 6:47 p.m., not a call, a text. "Hey, hope your day was good." No mention of what day it was. He drove home, changed out of his new shirt, folded it carefully and placed it back in the drawer, and then he opened the cake box alone. He had set the table for one, not out of hope, not out of habit, just because some quiet, stubborn part of him believed that even a man eating alone on his birthday deserved a proper place setting, a real plate, a folded napkin, a single candle pushed into the center of the small cake he'd ordered 6 days earlier. He lit the candle, he sat down, and for a long moment he just looked at the flame. That small, steady, completely indifferent flame that flickered softly in the silence of an apartment that had never felt quite so large, quite so empty, quite so honest about what his life had quietly become. He picked up his fork, put it back down, opened his journal to the date, March 14th, and held his pen above the page for almost a full minute without writing a single word. Because what do you write? What do you record for a day that contained nothing worth remembering? What do you say to the blank page when the blank page is the most company you've had all evening? The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes until the day was officially over. 13 minutes until he could close his journal, blow out the candle, and file this birthday away in the same quiet drawer where he kept every other disappointment he'd never told anyone about. And then, a knock at the door. He didn't move at first. His mind ran through every logical explanation. A neighbor with a noise complaint he hadn't caused, Philip needing something, a delivery for the wrong floor, anything, any reason in the world that wasn't the one his heart was too tired to dare consider. He opened the door. Standing in the hallway, slightly breathless, holding a small potted plant wrapped in brown paper and a cream-colored envelope, was Nora Vale. 3rd floor, apartment 3C. The woman he had exchanged perhaps 12 sentences with in 2 years of living in the same building. She had dark eyes that noticed things and a quiet way of existing in a room that reminded Elliot oddly of himself. She looked at him, took a small breath, and said simply and without rehearsal, "I know this is strange. I almost didn't come, but I remembered, and I didn't want the day to end without someone saying it." She paused. "Happy birthday, Elliot." He stood in the doorway of his own apartment, in the soft yellow light of his hallway, holding the door handle like it was the only solid thing in the world. And for the first time all day, for the first time in 3 years of March 14ths that passed like ordinary Thursdays, something inside his chest cracked open, not with sadness, with relief, the unbearable, unexpected, overwhelming relief of being seen. While Elliot was opening his door to the one person who remembered him, the people who forgot him were exactly where you'd expect them to be. Derek was at a bar called Sutton's 3 miles away, laughing at something someone said that he wouldn't remember by morning. He had his arm around a friend's shoulder, a drink in his other hand, and that wide, effortless smile that had always made rooms turn toward him. His phone was face up on the bar counter, buzzing occasionally with notifications he glanced at and dismissed. At some point during the evening, somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd round, a small thought crossed his mind, something he was supposed to remember, and then someone made another joke and the thought dissolved, unexamined, into the noise. He slept well that night. That's the thing about forgetting someone who never demands to be remembered. It costs you nothing, not immediately, not on the night it happens. The bill for that kind of carelessness doesn't arrive right away. It waits. It accumulates quietly, the way debt does, until one ordinary day it lands on your doorstep and you realize with sudden, uncomfortable clarity exactly what you've been spending. For Derek, that day came 3 weeks later. His car broke down on a dark stretch of road outside the city at 9 p.m. on a Wednesday, not a neighborhood he knew. Rain coming down in that heavy, relentless way that makes everything feel more desperate than it actually is. He sat in his car and went through his contacts the way people do in moments of genuine need, not scrolling for the most fun name, but for the most reliable one. The name his fingers found without thinking, the name that had always meant this person will come, was Elliot. He called. Elliot answered on the second ring. Of course he did, but something in Elliot's voice that night was different. It wasn't cold, it wasn't punishing. There was no anger in it, no pointed silence designed to make Derek feel the weight of what he'd done. It was simply quieter, more settled, like a man who had recently learned something important about himself and was still getting used to carrying it. Derek noticed. And in the 2 hours it took for the tow truck to arrive, sitting in his car listening to the rain, he had nothing to do but think about what exactly had changed in his oldest friend's voice, and why it sounded, disturbingly, like distance. He thought about March 14th for the first time, really thought about it, and the discomfort that moved through him in that dark, wet roadside silence was not the sharp pain of guilt, but something slower and more honest, the gradual recognition of a man seeing, perhaps for the first time, the full shape of what he had always taken for granted. Meanwhile, Cora called Elliot on a Sunday evening 3 weeks after his birthday, breezy and chatty, and completely unsuspecting of what was about to happen to her. She was midway through a story about her youngest son's school play when she stopped herself and said almost as an afterthought, "Oh, by the way, I feel terrible. I don't even think I properly said happy birthday this year, did I?" Elliot was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "You didn't," he said, gently, plainly. The way you state a fact about the weather, the silence that followed was the longest Cora had ever experienced on a phone call with her brother, not because Elliot made it uncomfortable, but because she did that entirely to herself, in the sudden devastating space between what she had assumed and what was actually true. She cried that night after she put the kids to bed, not loudly, not dramatically. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold, and thought about every time she had described her brother to other people as, "Oh, Elliot's so easygoing, he never needs anything," and understood, with the particular shame of someone who should have known better, that she had confused his quiet strength with an absence of need, that he had needs, that he had always had needs, and that she had simply never made enough room to ask about them. 2 weeks later, a handwritten letter arrived at Elliot's apartment, 3 pages. Cora's handwriting, slightly uneven the way handwriting gets when emotions are running faster than the pen. It was the first letter she had written since childhood, and at the office the karma arrived softer but no less precise. Elliot simply stopped paying for Friday lunch. No announcement, no explanation. He just stopped, picked up his own meal, sat down, and ate. The first Friday, everyone assumed he'd forgotten. The second Friday, confusion settled over the table like weather. By the third Friday, his colleague Pete finally asked carefully, "Hey, did we do something wrong?" Elliot looked up from his food with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely serious and said, "I just realized generosity should go both ways." Nobody laughed, nobody argued. One by one, in the slightly stunned silence of people confronting a mirror they didn't expect, they each reached for the bill. And that, quietly, was the beginning of something more honest between all of them. Karma, in my experience, rarely arrives as lightning. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform. It simply shows up one ordinary day in the form of a question you suddenly can't stop asking yourself. Have I been the kind of person I believe myself to be? For the people in Elliot's life, that question arrived right on schedule. Some things don't announce themselves as healing. They arrive quietly, the way good things often do, in small, unhurried moments that you don't recognize as significant until much later, when you look back and realize that that was the turning point. That was the moment the weight shifted. That was when the version of yourself that had been slowly disappearing started, carefully and without fanfare, to return. For Elliot, healing looked like Tuesday evenings on the 5th floor, talking to a woman from the 3rd floor who brought her sketchbook and never once checked her phone while he was speaking. He and Nora didn't rush into anything. That wasn't who either of them were. They were both people who had learned through different roads and different losses that the things worth having are the things worth being patient for. So they built something slowly, carefully, the way Elliot built structures, with attention to the foundation first, before anything else. She would bring her illustrations up on evenings when neither of them had anywhere else to be, which was most evenings. He would make tea badly, and she would fix it without making him feel embarrassed about it. They talked about books they loved and buildings that moved them, and the particular sadness of cities at night, when everyone else seems to be somewhere they belong. They talked about his mother, about the journal, about what it costs a person to give endlessly to a world that forgets to give back. Nora understood that cost in her own way. She had her own version of invisible, her own years of being present for people who treated her presence as furniture. And somewhere in the quiet recognition of two people who had both spent too long on the edges of other people's lives, something honest and unhurried began to grow between them. One evening, about 6 weeks after his birthday, Elliot opened his journal to a fresh page. He uncapped his pen, and at the very top, in the same careful handwriting he used for everyone else's important dates, he wrote a single line. Nora's birthday, September 3rd. He stared at it for a moment. Then he closed the journal, set it back on the desk, and sat with the quiet significance of what he'd just done. For the first time in 3 years, he had written someone's name in that journal, not out of obligation, not out of habit, but out of genuine, tender, freely chosen care. It felt different. It felt like something beginning. And then March 14th came around again. His 39th birthday arrived on a Saturday, and the morning was different from the first breath of it. His phone buzzed at 7:03 a.m., Derek's name on the screen, an actual call, not a text. His voice slightly awkward in the way of a man who knows he owes something and is trying, imperfectly but sincerely, to start paying it back. They talked for 20 minutes. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and real, Elliot had come to understand, was worth infinitely more than perfect. Cora sent flowers, actual flowers, delivered to his door with a card that said simply, "You are the best thing our family has. I'm sorry it took me so long to say it out loud." The colleagues sent a card, signed by everyone. Pete had written a small note inside that said, "Fridays are better when they're fair." Elliot smiled at that for a long time. The world had quietly, gently corrected itself. Not dramatically, not with grand gestures or sweeping apologies, just the slow, honest adjustment of people who had looked at themselves in the mirror and decided to be slightly better than they had been before. But none of that, not Derek's call, not Cora's flowers, not the card from the office, was the moment that Elliot carried with him longest from that day. The moment that stayed was what he found at 7 a.m., before any of the calls or messages arrived, before the day had fully begun. A small rolled illustration slipped under his apartment door sometime before dawn, wrapped in brown paper tied with simple twine. He unrolled it slowly, standing in his doorway in the early morning quiet. It was a drawing, Nora's unmistakable hand. At the bottom, in her small, careful handwriting, 4 words, "You were always enough." Elliot stood in his doorway for a long time. The city outside his window was just beginning to wake up. Somewhere below, a car moved slowly down the street. A bird started somewhere in the distance. The morning was arriving the way mornings do, indifferent to everything that happened the night before, offering itself fresh and clean and full of quiet possibility. He looked at the drawing for a long time, and then Elliot Crane, for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, smiled. Not with relief, not with the exhausted gratitude of a man who has finally been thrown a rope, but with the deep, settled, unshakable fullness of a man who has finally, completely come home to himself. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the crowd to notice them. Elliot had something better. He had one person who paid attention, and it turned out that was everything. And that is where I want to leave you for a moment, not rushing to the next thing, not scrolling past, just here. With this story, with whatever it stirred up inside you while you were listening. Because I think some of you didn't just watch this story, I think some of you lived it. Maybe not in the exact details, maybe it wasn't a birthday, maybe it wasn't a kitchen table with one candle, but in the feeling, that specific, quiet, deeply human feeling of pouring yourself into people and relationships and moments, and wondering in the stillness of an honest night whether any of it is truly flowing back to you. If that landed somewhere real in your chest tonight, I want you to know something important. You are not invisible. You are not too easy. You are not too quiet or too giving or too much of the person who shows up so reliably that everyone forgets to show up for you. You are not a supporting character in your own life, no matter how long the world has treated you like one. Elliot's story is not just a story about a birthday. It is a story about what happens when a person finally stops shrinking themselves to fit comfortably into spaces that were never built to hold them fully. It is a story about the strange and precise mercy of the universe, how it sometimes has to empty a room completely before it can fill it with something real, how the people who were never supposed to stay sometimes have to leave or forget or disappoint you, so that the one person who was always meant to find you finally has enough space to walk through the door. And maybe, just maybe, this video found you tonight for exactly that reason. So here is what I want you to do right now before you go anywhere. If this story moved you, if it found something in you that needed finding, hit that like button, not as a transaction, not because the algorithm asked you to, but because stories like this one only reach the people who need them when the people who felt them decide to pass them forward. Your like is the knock on someone else's door tonight. Your share is the rolled-up illustration slipped under a stranger's door before dawn. You might never know whose March 14th you just changed, but you changed it. Share this video with someone who gives more than they receive, with someone who always shows up but rarely gets shown up for, with the Elliot in your life who has been quietly, patiently, beautifully holding everything together while everyone else looks the other way. They need to hear this tonight. They need to know that the universe has not forgotten them. It is simply preparing exactly who they need. Subscribe if you haven't already, because this channel exists for one reason only: to tell the stories that find you when you need them most. Stories about real human beings, real moments, real karma, and the real, radical, quietly revolutionary act of choosing to see people the way they deserve to be seen. And finally, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, has anyone ever surprised you when everyone else forgot? Have you ever been the person who forgot and had to sit with that? Or are you someone who has been quietly waiting, like Elliot, for the knock on the door that finally proves you were worth remembering all along? Write it, all of it. I read every single comment, every single one, because if this channel stands for anything, it stands for this. Nobody who shows up here leaves feeling invisible. Not on my watch, not ever. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying until the end. And remember, somewhere out there tonight, there is a candle still burning for you. Don't blow it out.